So welcome everyone to our webinar today, Understanding and Addressing Climate Resilience at an Organisational Level. Today we are joined by Anna Tuddenham and Charles van Tuyckom. Anna is a senior climate change consultant based on Ttfd's digital service portfolio with over 7 years climate change experience obtained and developed while delivering projects for both public and private sector clients. Charles is an associate in Ttfd's environment team and specialises in developing climate and sustainable strategies for organisations. Today's webinar will explore how organisations can address relevant climate risks and foster resilience through the development of relevant and tailored principles and strategies, following a risk and opportunity-based approach. As always, there's a chance to ask questions at the end of the presentation, so please submit these in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen at any point during the presentation. I will then ask these on your behalf later on. Thank you for logging in, and I'll now hand over to Anna and Charles.
Thanks, Derek, and yeah, hi everyone. Thanks a lot for attending today. It's really a pleasure for both of us to present to you guys on that topic of understanding and addressing climate resilience at an organizational level. Sorry. So yeah, as mentioned, Anna and I are both members of Ttfd Climate Change and Sustainability Services team. We have kind of our own specialism. I tend to focus more on developing strategies for organizations, asset owners, asset investors, and helping them implement those strategies and goals around climate and sustainability at wide. And then Anna specializes a bit more on a topical level at climate change. And maybe I'll let Anna give a very quick intro in addition to that before we go on to the agenda.
Sure. So yeah, my specialism is kind of directly in climate change. So climate change risk, adaptation and resilience. And I also work on carbon mitigation as well. But yeah, more on the risk assessment side of projects with a slightly different client focus. So rather than kind of finance, it's more infrastructure related and kind of private sector organizations.
Thanks, Anna. And so yeah, so we work together a lot on different projects. And so what we wanted to do is give you a bit of an intro to sort of set the scene and lead us to sort of look at a definition of what climate resilience is. So that's when Anna will take over and then take you through key guidance and frameworks and sort of standards out there that are used to address climate resilience, and also the regulatory context, because there's a lot moving around there. Which will be interesting to look at, and then we'll look at the challenges that we see, leveraging on our experience, at organizational level, logistical level, again for organizations that address climate resilience, and then we'll finish with the key takeaways before we go to the Q&A. So I think to get started, to get into it, we wanted to sort of bring it to you in a very tangible way, I guess, and so we've put here a few extracts from news articles that we've seen. Apologies, that really demonstrate that climate risk and climate change is really omnipresent. It's everywhere in society, and it touches upon many different aspects. So I think, for example, what we see is that heat waves and hotter summers that we see in the UK and in Europe, for example, these days, and their frequency being higher, that leads to an increased number of death and health impacts. In the US, the Public Administration has identified that as a bigger threat than polio, for example, to public health. Climate change, as you know, is also a key issue, when we look at a macroeconomic level, so a key issues and a really a weight on our global economy. It's been qualified as a bigger threat than pandemics and wars, for example, to our global economy, and obviously that then challenges governments to deliver, for example, social benefits to societies, etc., and that then has also a social impact and touches upon inequality and aspects like that. As we know, food shortages are affected because the agricultural sector is subject to climate change, uncertainties, etc. So that is another challenge to the global economy and the stability of economic and human development. There's a snippet here of the heat waves that we've seen in India recently, which is another example of tremendous extreme weather events. And something that keeps coming back is record temperatures in the Arctic and in Antarctica, which is really a key issue, knowing that obviously these are key areas of the world where that help regulate climate, basically. So I think with all that, we sort of wanted to synthesize what we see and sort of explaining that where it touches upon climate resilience is that from the point of view of an organization, we do know that organizations tend to have an impact on the earth systems and the environment, which provide services that provide a stable environment for organizations to evolve in. And so that is triggering a higher awareness from stakeholders, which then have different expectations, which translate, and we can definitely argue that maybe that isn't coming fast enough, or the response isn't proportionate enough at this stage, but that does trigger policy changes and changes in regulations, and that poses in itself a risk to organizations as they operate, because they have to keep up with more regulatory requirements, for example. The other side of the story is obviously that climate change, as it happens, means physical risks, which might be challenges for organizations as well, and that translates into operational and ultimately financial risks for those organizations who have to respond to those risks. And I think that sort of sets the scene then from there to move on to the definition that we've got here for climate resilience. Sorry, and I'll let Anna take over here.
Thanks, Charles. So we thought we'd just set off with a bit of a definition, because there's so much discrepancy in definitions sometimes. So as Charles has said, climate change is occurring, there's plenty of evidence, and we need to prepare for its impacts. So resilience is one way of thinking about how to do that. The concept of resilience originally comes from engineering and initially referred to solid materials' ability to undergo external stress without breaking or losing functionality. But today, the concept of resilience proliferates in fields as disparate as psychology and IT and business. So, as I said, there's probably hundreds of definitions of resilience in existence. In terms of climate change resilience, this really means strengthening the ability of human and non-human systems to withstand and respond to changes in the Earth's climate. So it can be thought of a way to bridge the conceptual divide between mitigation approaches to climate change on the one hand and adaptation approaches on the other. Now, several frameworks have emerged to provide us with this common language and framework to assess and manage climate change risk. And I'll now talk a little bit more about two of them, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures and the EU Taxonomy. So to start off with the TCFD, this was established by the Financial Stability Board, which is an international body that monitors and makes recommendations about the global financial system to promote financial stability within the system. Now, the ultimate goal of the TCFD framework is to ensure that companies are thinking about and understanding climate risk and ensuring that this is effectively disclosed to the market. Now, they published a report in 2017, which established recommendations for disclosing clear, comparable, and consistent information about the risks and also the opportunities presented by climate change. Various reports have been released since this initial report, which provide more industry and sector-specific guidance. Now, the widespread adoption of the recommendations within the report ideally will ensure that the effects of climate change become routinely considered in business and investment decisions. They'll also help companies better demonstrate responsibility and foresight in their consideration of climate issues. And ultimately, this is hoped to lead to more efficient capital allocation and help smooth the transition to a more sustainable low carbon economy. Charles, if we just go to the next slide. Perfect, thank you. So what's the scope of the TCFD framework? As I said, this is a framework for organisations to think about climate risks and opportunities and disclose these to the market. It intends to provide recommendations that are adoptable by all organisations and designed to solicit decision-useful, forward-looking information on financial impacts. Within the framework, climate-related risks are separated into two types of risk: physical and transition. So physical risks relate to the physical impacts of climate change on an organisation, such as increased frequency and magnitude of flooding on, say, key manufacturing sites, and how this might translate into financial impacts in the future. Transition risks relate to the risks that come in the move to a low carbon economy and the financial impact of these risks. So this covers, for example, the financial implications of implementing a carbon tax. As mentioned, it's important to note that the framework does recognise opportunities and the potential benefits that could be achieved. So it's not all about risks. Next slide, please. So just moving on to say a few words about what the recommendations and disclosures are and how there's been a move to mandatory disclosure in the UK. So the task force's recommendations and supported recommended disclosures presented in the figure on the screen here, split across the 4 aspects: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. Now, organisations should include these disclosures within their financial filings or other reports to provide decision useful information to investors and other stakeholders. As of the 6th of April this year, over 1,300 of the largest UK registered companies and financial institutions were required to disclose climate-related financial information on a mandatory basis. So there's been a real movement in this direction, particularly in the UK, but also in a couple of other countries around the world, using guidelines from the Ttfd. And in the UK context, full mandatory climate-related financial disclosure requirements will come into force across the entire UK economy by 2025, with a significant portion of requirements in place by 2023. So this is sort of growing in its reach to organisations and those that will need to disclose. So just moving on to the EU taxonomy, the second framework we'll look at today. This is another framework or tool that's arisen over the past few years. The taxonomy is a classification system of environmentally sustainable economic activities. This has been created to help investors make green investments. So put simply, it's a dictionary style tool that details specific business activities that are considered sustainable by the EU. Now, 6 objectives have been identified that you can see on the screen in the circle there. And these include climate change adaptation and climate change mitigation. Now, the taxonomy looks at several sectors, including agriculture, manufacturing, transportation, energy, construction, communications. And for each sector, it provides industry relevant activities that could be considered sustainable. It then looks at each activity through the lens of 6 environmental objectives by providing a list of substantial contribution criteria and do no significant harm criteria for each of those. This taxonomy fills 2 important needs. 1, it provides us with a common language for talking about sustainability. And 2, it uses objective, quantifiable criteria for assessing businesses. Now, it's been primarily used to be a tool for sustainable investment, but it puts everyone on a bit more of a level playing field and helps investors understand more clearly where companies stand in relation to one another. So now just hand back to Charles. He'll talk about the challenges.
Yep. Thanks, Anna. Yeah, so with all that, so showing that there's a lot happening. There's the recognition that there's different kinds of risks, as we said, transition risks, but also physical risks. What we do find is that it is a challenge for organizations because all this is quite new, it's evolving quite fast, and the risk landscape is sometimes quite complex. And as you probably know, it's those risks also interrelate, they interplay with each other, and it's quite tricky. And what we find on the ground is that when organizations try to respond to those risks, one initial challenge is really to define and understand what climate risks are, and so it is basically about being aware of what those risks are and how they actually are relevant to any particular organization. So obviously, in different contexts, these will be different and they will manifest in different ways. And so that is usually something that is quite tricky for organization to do and recognize as a starting point. I think in practice, what we see is that we've had, for example, a project with it's a confidential client, so we won't mention the name, but it's essentially a manufacturer in the US, and they have basically seen, firsthand what that means, because I don't know if you recall the conditions in Texas last year in the winter, where they had a lot of snow and it was very cold, and that has really disrupted the distribution chain to deliver their products to the US market, and they have therefore lost quite a lot of contracts not meeting their obligations given this disruption to their distribution chain. So that has been an example of basically witnessing firsthand what that means, and they have therefore decided from that to basically do a big assessment of climate risks to understand the full landscape and basically consider every potential risk and how they could manifest and how they could affect their operations in the future. So that is usually that lack of awareness that organizations don't go that step, and there's a tendency to sort of focus on CO2 emissions because that is a hot topic, as we know, especially the UK is net zero, but there's a whole other suite of risks that are relevant and could very well be real. Another thing that we see is that there's financial constraints for organizations when they look to implement adaptive actions. And that means usually once you know what your risk landscape is, then you sort of go ahead and sort of try and address those risks. And what we find is that sometimes organizations might actually start off with ambitious sort of programs or ideas about what they want to implement. But as soon as you sort of realize the cost of the investment that is required to implement measures or to start responding to those risks, very often they sort of back down. And that is explained by the fact that there isn't, even though regulations coming up now, there isn't really yet a level playing field, or at least a level playing field that is sufficient to provide the incentives that would enable sort of organizations to go that extra step. So we do find that organizations sort of stop at some point, because there is a risk there to incur more costs, which might be deterrent to competitive advantage, for example, in the long term, or even the mid or short term. So that is a big issue, financial constraint, and that sort of tells us, I guess, consultants, and even more so, I guess, maybe scientists are there, that there is really a key role to play in being able to sort of bring that message to organizations, to civil society, to understand that those risks are real, and that there is value in actually investing in tackling them right now. And so the third point that we've got on the screen here, organizational inertia, is sort of a testament to that. It's again, recognizing the gap between the timing of your cost in the short term and the benefits that you might reap from preserving or enhancing value in the long term. So yeah, that is essentially that. And so again, many projects that Anna and I do together, we do find that organizations might step back from their ambition because of cost, because of being competition concerns. Other challenges are very much related to implementation. The use of climate change scenario analysis, for example, is a good one. As Anna mentioned, the Ttfd, they publish reports every year, status reports that sort of also show and tell how organizations that follow the Ttfd frameworks are doing. And the one main challenge that keeps coming back is implementing climate change scenario analysis, and basically that is quantifying or understanding the risks that are posed by climate change. Even more so, obviously, in the long term, it is just tricky to sort of quantify that and therefore make a case for making investment in the short term. And so that is something that is relatively new, and methodologies are still developing. It's moving quite fast, but there's still a lot of assumptions and constraints in delivering scenario analysis that is fully reliable, I guess, or that manages to get through to the decision makers fully. And then the lack of clarity on ownership of risks and the responses is also something that we see happening, because all this is quite new. Very often in organizations, it means basically creating almost a new function or embedding new responsibilities and new skills within an existing staff or human resources, and that obviously takes time. That obviously takes leveraging on best practice out there. And again, this is something that is relatively new and evolving. And so that is something that takes time, where organizations sometimes struggle with embedding that into their organization. Another key thing that we find around this is that if an organization identifies relevant risks, it might identify risks that sit outside of their direct control, for example, upstream across their supply chain. And obviously that poses a question of, who should tackle those risks in the supply chain, and who should, how should investments go about tackling those risks? Because if you're a manufacturer, for example, and you rely on suppliers to bring your materials to you, you do want to make sure that that doesn't disrupt your commercial activities. But but those risks do sit outside your direct control. So that poses a question of how do you develop relationships with suppliers, for example, or how do you set essentially criteria or requirements for your suppliers when they work with you. So yeah, that is kind of the main challenges that we see. I don't know, Anna, if there's anything else that I might have missed at this point.
No, I think that's a really good summary. Clearly, it's quite a fast-moving space with these kind of frameworks coming forward, and they're often quite high level, so it is quite difficult for organisations to interpret how best to apply them. So yeah, a lot of our work previously has been helping organisations to apply them in a kind of a robust and helpful way. Because ultimately, although we have these frameworks like the Ttfd, which is driving at understanding the financial risk, most organisations are earlier on in the process and still kind of identifying risk and doing those assessments that include that scenario analysis you mentioned. So yeah, there's a way to go in terms of really being able to organisations having that capacity to be able to apply these frameworks and therefore push through to kind of the right kind of adaptation measures and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, I think, sort of brings us to, before we go ahead and take your questions, I think we wanted to sort of bring those key takeaways, 4 key takeaways. Yeah, the number 5 here is just the number of the section, but it's 4 key takeaways. The first one, as we saw, is to understand and defining climate resilience or your climate risk landscape at an organizational level. And again, as we said, this is very dependent on your context. It might be technology, sector, geography, but it is very much a unique sort of exercise for every organization to really understand their risk exposure. There is a point about defining then strategies, targets, and employing frameworks and guidance out there that are best practice and embedding that into their organization. As we just saw, implementation challenges, organizational challenges in sort of bringing the right processes, the right tools in place, and also upskilling staff or creating a new function and embedding practices into the whole of the organization. And then risk management, I guess that is more from a continual sort of improvement point of view. As we mentioned, challenges to doing scenario analysis and keeping up to date with risk forecasts, up to date with policies, up to date with predictions, sorry. And embedding that again in your risk planning, in your management practices. And yeah, so that is pretty much it for us. 5 minutes early. Back over to you then, Derek, I guess.
Great, thank you guys. So just to say, if anyone does have any questions, if you pop them in the Q&A box. So we've got one question here from Mark, and it says, what has been done to identify the genuine thinking of organizations around the financial tipping point between taking action, not taking action? For example, is there a point at which the risk of going bust is preferable to paying for adaptation measures?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Maybe I'll put a couple of thoughts there and then Charles can follow on from me. But I think it's a great question, and actually not that much work has been done necessarily to look at that just yet. A lot of sort of specific organizations are still looking at how they can kind of put a price on the risks that they're identifying, and which are actually material risks that might affect kind of the balance of the company. But what I would say is there is this concept of stranded assets that you might be familiar with. So this is sort of a term that's been bandied about for a while, but it's really sort of around getting people to think about the implications of not adjusting investment in line with emissions trajectories that are required to meet this 2-degree world. And stranded assets are generally those assets that sort of at some time prior to the end of their economic life, they're no longer able to earn an economic return. So, when you're thinking about this, you might be thinking about sort of oil and gas reserves or sort of production and processing facilities for particular products that we may shift away from. Clearly, we're not quite there yet, but when we're thinking about transition risks and so on, that's where the kind of the narrative is going, and that's likely where we'd start to see it. So where companies are tending to look into. But I think, yeah, it's a good question. It's not necessarily kind of studied enough, and I think organizations, have a lot of uncertainties in their decision making, and climate isn't always the one that they sort of give priority when making these kind of decisions at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's yeah, completely agree. I think that is a key question. It's almost like the key question, because all of this is kind of about incentives, isn't it? It's about being able to demonstrate, even if we do know that the science shows that climate risk should be tackled, etc. There's and it's because it's difficult. We're not basically we're not quantifying this or even monetizing these risks. We're not managing to, because it's really difficult. But many of us are convinced of the importance of that, and so there is a point about being able to demonstrate that incentive in a way that makes sense, and there's probably a big role to play by governments and regulations in incentivizing this. The carbon price is one avenue, but there's much more, and there is I guess from a point of view of a consultant, there's a true opportunity to be able to actually do that and demonstrate the value of tackling risk and demonstrate I guess the balance, the trade-off to organizations. And obviously the scientific community has a big role to play there as well. Yeah.
Perfect, thank you both. That is that for the questions. Thank you. Your presentation was very interesting. So I'll just say that's it from us today. Attendees, thank you for logging in, and I hope you found that beneficial.